A year has passed, so it's time for my next State of Animation, where I will talk about 2025's productions, news, and trends so as to gauge the health of the animation industry. Unlike my first one, I don't need to catch up on the years leading up to now, so we can get right into what's new. I ended the previous year's video with an air of uncertainty about 2025, and I uploaded that video on January 3rd. And talk about timing, because oh boy, just 4 days after that, we had quite the portent of what was to come. The one silver lining is that the Los Angeles fires seemingly only caused slight delays and complications in the animation industry, but that does nothing to change the larger, more important tragedy that real people had their livelihoods and lives destroyed. And while that was certainly the most devastating story to come out of this year, it's far from the only bad news. We've had companies removing their works from platforms, unfortunate cancellations, countless layoffs likely exasperated by AI, not to mention the other problems it's causing, many companies, even major ones, shutting down, and consumers continuing to be blindly responsible for many of the things they love to complain about, with sequels, spin-offs, remakes, and otherwise repetitive works continuing to get more media coverage and money than original stuff. And while not an original property, I'm pretty sure more people talked about the importance of watching The Day the Earth Blew Up than actually watching it, and that film could have helped Western frame-by-frame animation become popular again. The decline of physical media is affecting every industry, but I know, and you know, that animation, especially Western animation, will likely be hit by this first and hardest. At least Tom and Jerry got probably one of the best physical releases of classic animation ever, and now we have Warner Brothers being sold to the surprise of no one. Good acquisition, guys. And some people are stupid enough to take the bait. Assuming this Netflix deal goes through, we can expect things to get even worse for Warner-owned properties. But it hasn't all been bad. First things first, Flow winning the Oscar and Golden Globe was one of the most uplifting stories to come out of 2025. The last few wins were different, but not surprising, but an independently produced Latvian film winning these two awards says a lot about the wider film industry's acceptance of animation on a global, smaller scale. The medium is also growing increasingly popular, especially among younger audiences, but mostly to a narrow extent. Animation has also been doing better financially than ever before. At least when it isn't hemorrhaging money and going out of business. Another interesting demographic trend is that, relatively speaking, a large number of this year's productions have been Christian, and they've had quite a bit of success. Not that that's an inherently good or bad thing, it's just something interesting I noticed. And in terms of distribution, more studios are putting their new releases up for free on YouTube. In some ways this is nice because it makes more animation more accessible, but financially this will almost certainly work out even worse than over-reliance on streaming platforms already had. So yeah, look forward to that. And since I'm slipping into cynicism again, can I just say that I am so sick of choppy animation, especially in 3D? It went from an occasional thing done for stylization or practical purposes, to something being blindly done because it's trendy, and because companies can use it as an excuse for and a way to try hiding shitty animation. On a similar note, I've noticed that characters are getting less and less expressive, which is especially problematic in animation, as characters' faces don't match their voices, which makes the acting less convincing and emotional beats weaker. Now let's discuss actual productions, starting with the big American companies. This might be one of Pixar's worst years on record, releasing their biggest box office disappointment to date and facing controversy for their first original show. Disney's doing better, but still has problems of their own. This is the first year in a long time during which Illumination hasn't released anything, which, depending on how you look at it, could be seen as a good thing and/or a bad sign. DreamWorks and Paramount have both been pretty unnoteworthy. Amazon's been relying too heavily on established names while also doing some pretty shitty things. Apple's shows have been doing relatively well, even if not amazingly, and as we've already established, Warner Brothers has completely fallen apart, including Cartoon Network's likely inevitable demise, and outside of a few exceptions, their output largely reflects that. In contrast, Netflix has had probably its best year ever, and it's largely because of one Sony film. I just wish the property that blew up was something I actually liked. The rest of Netflix's output I had mixed feelings toward as well. Let's shift gears and talk about the biggest producer of animation today, Japan. And I'm not exaggerating. Japanese animation has literally never been bigger than it is, with it seeping into every corner of pop culture and being probably the single biggest thing on the planet right now. But I regret to inform you that personally, I am still not fond of where the industry is. Although, to be fair, I think the shows coming out have been slightly better compared to last year. On top of many delays and financial losses, the Japanese industry is still over-relying on trends, unoriginality, pandering, mass marketability, poor production values, and bad business practices, all exasperated by oversaturation. On the international distribution side of things, Crunchyroll is increasingly becoming a monopoly that's contributing to some of these problems, and the massive popularity of Japanese animation is likely causing some of the lack of variety and quality control we've been seeing elsewhere. And this isn't just some dumb Americans saying all this negative stuff. Japanese people actually working in the industry are echoing many of these sentiments. Like I've said it before, Japanese animation as it currently stands is not sustainable, and it's a bubble that will almost certainly burst soon if things don't change. But undeniably, Japan is the primary reason that animation is as big as it is now. I just wish that people would broaden their horizons and extend that attention to other countries. Speaking of which, other countries are simultaneously doing better and worse than usual. I already mentioned Flow, but that was technically from last year. As for stuff from this year, the most obvious thing to point out is that China has claimed the title for the highest-grossing animated film, although most of that was domestically earned, so it wasn't quite as successful worldwide as one might think. India also had their most successful film domestically. Countries including, but not limited to Mexico, Lithuania, and South Africa have had their own noteworthy accomplishments. France has had numerous critically well-received films, as well as a show that got more attention internationally than most of its peers. However, many European countries are having a harder time selling their IP, and when it comes to shows, it seems like a lot of countries are relying too heavily on targeting very young audiences, in spite of the fact that the audience for animation is wider than ever. Unfortunately, this year I was unable to watch in theaters any film made outside of the US because they weren't being distributed widely enough. For comparison, last year I was able to relatively easily watch Flow, Memoir of a Snail, and Robot Dreams in theaters. This lack of distribution might be at least in part a result of tariffs, though another likely culprit is that American distributors and theaters just have no faith in foreign-made films that aren't Japanese, which would, of course, be a self-fulfilling prophecy. In any case, the fact that someone as passionate about animation as me wasn't able to watch any of these films in theaters illustrates the extent to which animation in most countries is struggling to even just be seen. To be fair, this could to some extent be said about previous years, and many of these films probably will or are already confirmed to be getting wider releases stateside in 2026. But as far as I can tell, there's very little reason for this practice. While I don't doubt there are legal, financial, and other hurdles involved, distribution of media and spreading news about it are easier than ever. If these films could get fairly wide US releases in their initial year, why not these films? Especially considering festivals, award ceremonies, and people's annual lists, this makes it harder for audiences to be aware of and invested in animated films coming out, and by extension be passionate about the medium as a whole. And so you have a vicious cycle of people not paying attention to these smaller countries which need all the help they can get. Speaking of animation from all walks of life, independent animation has been doing increasingly well to the point where its most successful releases are just as, if not more successful than AAA productions. Although honestly, some of these probably don't even count as independent anymore. It's been cool seeing a lot of the old guard working independently, including with new voices. One trend I've noticed is that a lot of people are putting out their pilots as animatics rather than fully animated productions, which is honestly probably a smarter move. I also feel like the quality is slightly better, and that we've seen a bit more variety this year, even if it's still not as varied as indie animation could and should be. However, I do worry that independent animation is becoming increasingly corporate. Lots of indie studios seem to be investing more into selling merch and manufacturing fan bases right out the gates than actually making their goddamn shows. Some productions are disgustingly littered with mid-roll ads, and most of the successful shows are being acquired by just a few companies. If you think about it, this is exactly what you would expect from traditional media, so at the rate things are going, independent animation could quickly become the very thing it was originally opposing. If this video has seemed mostly negative, that's because I honestly don't have much good to say about this year. As I alluded to at the beginning, 2025 has for the most part been a complete dumpster fire for the animation industry. Companies being especially terrible, a lack of originality and variety, overall poor quality, audiences developing worsening openness, attentiveness, and discourse, and even though many countries have seen better promise of success than ever before, they're struggling to get the exposure that they need. Looking back at 2024, I honestly feel like I was a little harsh on it. That's not to say that it was a good year. Many of the problems now were prevalent then, too. But at the very least, there were a fair number of really good movies that came out and got good exposure. This year, The best films I saw still weren't as good as last year's, and the ones that maybe would have been I wasn't even able to watch, and the shows at best were only slightly better. I know I'm in the minority on this, as most people are obsessed with things such as K-pop Demon Hunters and the onslaught of interchangeable Japanese shows, but I feel like even if you don't agree with my opinions on a lot of specific works, you can at least acknowledge that many of the broader problems I have addressed are very real, are unsustainable, and are bad signs of the industry's future. And on that note, let's look into the near future of 2026. For starters, several productions I mentioned last year got delayed to 2026, so copy and paste. In terms of the larger American studios, there are actually a lot more original movies than one might expect, even amidst all the unoriginality. Let's just hope that they're actually good and successful enough to convince studios to keep doing original stuff. We're also finally getting Coyote vs. Acme's release, and while I hope that it'll be good, I fear how its hypothetical success might influence studios' approach to animation. Coming off of their biggest hit, Netflix's next few films, several of which are produced by Skydance, have quite the competition, but at least Brad Bird's Ray Gun looks potentially interesting. The American show landscape looks pretty bleak though. As far as the things that we know of, the major studios are putting out almost nothing original, and there isn't much that looks enticing. In terms of Japanese animation, outside of a few things, it mostly looks the same, with Japanese studios continuing to play it safe, pander to a permissive audience, and stagnate the industry. I'll give special mention to an adaptation that I already had low expectations for, but considering the developments that have taken place, I feel pretty confident saying that it will be shit. There is some interesting stuff coming from other countries, but it's hard to look forward to those as, based on this past year, most of them will probably have little to no release and success outside of festivals and their own regions. So what are my expectations for 2026? There are actually a fair number of promising films from numerous countries, but in terms of shows, I could see it being worse than this year, and considering the escalating problems in the industry and its audience, it looks to me like 2026 might be comparable to 2024. Perhaps better than 2025 with a number of notably good productions, but otherwise pretty bad. But only time will tell. So let's hold on tight and hope that this video's release doesn't cause another disaster.